Chapter 7. The Disciples' Reaction. Jesus' statements about his views on divorce and remarriage in Matthew chapter 19 prompt a very interesting response from his disciples, which is extremely helpful as we try to understand his teaching on the matter. Quote, "And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for immorality, and marries another woman commits adultery. The disciples said to him, if the relationship of the man with his wife is like this, it is better not to marry. But he said to them, not all men can accept this statement, but only those to whom it has been given. For there are eunuchs who were born that way from their mother's womb, and there are eunuchs who were made eunuchs by men, and there are also eunuchs who made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. He who is able to accept this, let him accept it." Matthew chapter 19, verses 9 through 12. Upon hearing Jesus' statements in Matthew chapter 19, verse 9, the disciples act as if this teaching is astonishing, apparently because it seemed like a very strict teaching to them. They say, quote, "If the relationship of the man with his wife is like this, it is better not to marry," end quote. Their response is often overlooked or disregarded by many teachers, especially among those holding to the permissive view. But if we can understand why they reacted the way that they did to Jesus' teaching, it could be the final piece to the puzzle that we need to make the positive case for the traditional view. The Hillel versus Shammai problem. Modern interpreters are fond of bringing up the idea that in Matthew chapter 19, the Pharisees were trying to get Jesus' opinion on a popular debate going on at the time. They say that there were two main rabbinic views on this subject of divorce: the Hillel school and the Shammai school. The Shammai school was more conservative, saying that divorce was only allowed for unfaithfulness, and the Hillel school was more liberal, teaching that divorces were allowed for just about any reason. The story goes that in Matthew chapter 19, verse 9, Jesus sided with the more conservative school, the Shammai school, because he taught that divorce was allowed only in the case of immorality. Permissive view teachers say that the reason the disciples were so shocked by this was because Jesus sided with the more conservative school, as if the disciples couldn't imagine getting married if the only reason you could divorce your wife was because of sexual immorality. Problems with this view. The first problem I have with this view is that despite this being a very common thing for modern teachers to say, there is no evidence that the Hillel-Shammai debate existed in Jesus' day. John P. Meyer, a widely respected scholar on the historical Jesus, rejects that idea in his book, as does A. Andrew Das in his book, and they do so for very good reasons. But regardless of whether the names Hillel or Shammai were known in the first century, there was still a debate between the conservative and liberals about divorce, and the two sides had the same basic points that the Hillel and Shammai schools would later have. So it doesn't really matter all that much, but it is worth noting. The eunuch problem. The big problem for the permissive view here is that Jesus' further clarification about eunuchs in Matthew chapter 19, verse 12 doesn't make any sense if the permissive view about this passage is true. Let me show you why. After the disciples say, quote, "If the relationship of the man with his wife is like this, it is better not to marry," end quote, Jesus says the following, quote, "But he said to them, not all men can accept this statement, but only those to whom it has been given. For there are eunuchs who were born that way from their mother's womb, and there are eunuchs who were made eunuchs by men, and there are also eunuchs who made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. He who is able to accept this, let him accept it," end quote. Matthew chapter 19, verses 11 and 12. A eunuch is a man who has been castrated, and because he cannot have children or have sex, he typically would not get married. In other words, Jesus is telling his disciples that because of his teaching in the previous verses, it means that those who divorce will have to live celibate lives without spouses, just like eunuchs do. Jesus' teaching here only makes sense if remarriage is forbidden after divorce, which, as we have seen, is the very thing he taught in other places. Matthew chapter 5, verse 32, Luke chapter 16, verse 18, and Mark chapter 10, verses 11 and 12, and the very thing that the early church believed. No remarriage was shocking. As I argued in the last chapter, the Pharisees should have known that remarriage was forbidden after divorce because of Deuteronomy chapter 24 verses 1 through 4. But other than the Essenes who lived in the wilderness, the majority of the Jews did not see it that way. Both the Pharisees and the Sadducees taught that remarriage was acceptable after divorce. In fact, they had the same attitude about remarriage as the Romans, that remarriage was acceptable in any case where there was a divorce. The idea that remarriage would not be allowed after divorce would have been utterly shocking to both the Pharisees and the Sadducees. It would mean that a man should think very carefully about who he chooses to be his wife in the first place, and that he should be exceedingly sure that he wants to divorce her, because if he does divorce her, he will not be able to get another wife and will need to live a celibate life after that. The eunuch passage refutes the permissive view. The permissive interpretation of this passage can't be correct, because in their view the disciples assumed that they could get remarried after divorce. But there is no scenario where the disciples would have to live celibate lives as a result of Jesus' teaching, as interpreted by the permissive view. Permissive view example number 1. If, as a result of Jesus' teaching, a man remained married to his wife, despite wanting to get a divorce because his wife had not committed fornication, he would not have to live a eunuch-like celibate life, because he would still be married to his wife in this scenario. Permissive view example number 2. On the other hand, if his wife did commit fornication, and so he was able to divorce her in accordance with the permissive view's interpretation of Jesus' teaching, then he would be able to remarry, and thus he would not have to live a eunuch-like celibate life in that case either. In other words, as long as you assume that remarriage is acceptable in any case where a divorce is permitted, as the Pharisees, Sadducees, Romans, and almost every modern Christian pastor teach, then there is no reason to bring up eunuchs or living celibate lives because there is no scenario where this would be required in the permissive view. They know it doesn't make sense. The scholars know that the eunuch teaching makes no sense with the permissive view, which is why they teach that this section about the eunuchs doesn't have anything to do with the teaching about divorce and remarriage that came before it. They say that when Jesus says, quote, "Not all men can accept this statement, but only those to whom it has been given," end quote, in verse 11, he is not talking about what he previously said about divorce and remarriage, but about what he is about to say about eunuchs. So in their view, the teaching about the eunuchs would be a separate teaching, unrelated to divorce and remarriage. A. Andrew Das has a technical refutation of this idea in his book, which I will quote in the footnote, but I think it's rather obvious that Jesus was expanding on his disciples' shocked reaction to his teaching about remarriage. John Piper agrees that the eunuch teaching in verse 12 is about divorce and remarriage, and sums up all the issues we have discussed in this chapter very nicely. Quote, "In Matthew chapter 19, verse 9, Jesus prohibited all remarriage after divorce. This seemed like an intolerable prohibition to Jesus' disciples. If you close off every possibility of remarriage, then you make marriage so risky that it would be better not to marry, since you might be trapped to live as a single person for the rest of your life, or you may be trapped in a bad marriage." Jesus does not deny the tremendous difficulty of his command. Instead, he says in verse 11 that the enablement to fulfill the command not to remarry is a divine gift to his disciples. Verse 12 is an argument that such a life is indeed possible because there are people who, for the sake of the kingdom, as well as lower reasons, have dedicated themselves to live a life of singleness. End quote. Conclusion. Jesus' teaching in Matthew chapter 19 about divorce and remarriage presents a strict standard that was surprising even to his disciples, who responded by suggesting that it might be better not to marry at all. Jesus' subsequent reference to eunuchs reinforces the idea that remarriage is not an option after divorce. This teaching was countercultural and challenging, but Jesus emphasized that those who could accept this calling would do so for the sake of the kingdom of heaven.